Thank you, Shruti. There you are. I've been excited to lead this panel discussion since this morning and our talk about the CIO Innovation Index when I learned that 67% of you were interested in board service. We've assembled two seasoned experts to share their insights and dispel any myths around board service. Tuck and Patty, I'll let you introduce yourselves to the group.
I'm Patty Morrison. I recently retired from being a serial CIO, but I was more recently the Chief Information Officer at Cardinal Health for 9 years. I've also been on public boards for almost 20 years. I'm currently serving on my 5th public board. I previously were on the board of JOANN Stores and SPSS. JOANN went private. SPSS was acquired by IBM. And then in 2013, I joined the board of Splunk. And then I joined about 2 years ago the board of Aramark. And then this year, I joined the board of Baxter Healthcare. In all of my board work, I have always sat on audit committee because audit committee is most typically where you have cyber. And I've also chaired nom and governance. I chaired nom and governance for JOANN, and I am currently the chair of nom and governance for Splunk. So that's a little bit about my background.
Thank you.
This is Tuck Rickards. I run the San Francisco office for Russell Reynolds, and I bridge two practices, our board and CEO practice, and then I've run and built our digital transformation practice, and I've run our tech sector. So I sit at this intersection of whether half my work for disruptor companies, half the work for Fortune 500. Fortune 500 is around a chief digital officer type or a very transformational technology-oriented board person. I was formerly an internet entrepreneur and a banker with Goldman and Montgomery, so I kind of see the world from kind of a banker's lens as well as a tech lens. So this is a fun topic for me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to start by mentioning a great study that I read about. It was in the Wall Street Journal in the March timeframe. MIT conducted the study, and the study showed that if there were 3 technologists, CIOs, CTOs that were on boards of directors of public companies with revenues over $1 billion, they outperformed their peers with no technologists on their board by at least 5%. Great article to read. With that in mind, and with so much need for innovation, security, digital transformation at virtually every company that we have in existence today if we're to survive. What are you seeing in terms of board appointments today?
It's a great question, and we've been counting digital directors in the Fortune 500 or Global 1000 since for 7 years, and when we counted the first time in the US, there were 250 digital directors in public companies, which is hard to believe the way we counted them. We'd put kind of Sheryl Sandberg on the Disney board, was this kind of front-end digital person, and those were early days. Where we are now, I mean, companies, if you went through the businesses you all help lead, my sense is companies are halfway through a massive transformation or somewhere midway, and the boards are now saying, wow, we've got some technology perspective on the board, but what do we think about digital, AI, business transformation, becoming more an agile company? What other competitors or disruptors that play in my space? So the MIT report is really a diversity on boards report to me, where it says if you have 3, which is a magic number, and women on board discussions as well, you get a critical mass of technologists that are bringing some perspective to business discussions. And the data, and we've been looking for this for a long time, this has happened long enough, it really does show up in the performance data. I think it's pretty interesting, and we'll think of a qualified technology expert as the next gen of the qualified financial expert. It's not, it's both and. You need both of those.
What over the last, you've been doing this 20 years at Russell Reynolds, which is a phenomenal retained search firm. What else have you seen change in terms of composition on boards of directors?
So this is, old world of boards was our company did this and we'll do that again. Please find me someone who's been a CEO and maybe a financial expert who's been there, done it, who's now retired, who can mentor or coach me, who probably looks a lot like me. So that's old world. new world is everything is changing. Technology and disruption forces a change in composition of technology profiles. We're very involved with our board practice around what's happening on the activist side, what are the institutional investors looking for, the diversity on boards thing, and the California legislation, women on boards, big deal in terms of that driving meaningful change. And then you mentioned the word when we were chatting earlier, this difference between let me have a handful of people who've been there, done it the way they used to do it versus a set of functional experts more broadly and really diverse perspectives.
Interesting.
Like my future state of a board is, what does a board look like as more of an agile scrum? Like what does an agile board look like? How do you get different perspectives in the room? How do you get more real-time decision making? That's very different than rear wheel governance. I don't know if you're experiencing that as well on your board.
I think that boards today, it's still a challenge to bring in functional expertise in boards because they don't even know what questions to ask in the interview. I did a research paper it's probably 10 years ago on the relationship between CIOs and boards. And, it was when I would meet audit committee chairs at NACD events and they don't even know how to talk to a CIO. And so what you're faced with in the composition of boards is what you face with any diversity. It tends to self-proliferate, right, until you get a set of questions. And so I had one a very high-profile CEO here in the Valley who said her first board that she joined, she said when the CIO came in, it was like dogs watching TV. That there's just no one, they don't understand IT. I even interviewed a CEO candidate this week, and after the interview, he said to me, I'm really impressed with your business acumen. And I thought, this is a phenomena in IT, and as all of you think about boards, there's some still perceptual barriers that you don't understand strategy, you don't understand the business enough, that I can't understand because you're talking in geek speak. And I don't understand what questions to ask. And I think those are still quite there, but they're much improved. I found in my interviewing process for boards that the questions I was getting from directors who have no technology experience at least acknowledged that they better get someone on the board who does. And you can tell by their questions. So I think it's beginning to come around in terms of what people are really able to ask and look for in their board. That said, you do need to bring a lot of other things to a board. You have to be able to serve on a committee. Yes, I've learned everything around 606 and RevRec changes, more than I ever wanted to learn, as an audit committee person. And you have to be able to do that. You have to be able to serve as a committee chair. And there are some regulatory reasons why, some things are required in a board. And so it's in succession planning for a board, you have to take all those things into consideration. And those are the things you have to be prepared to answer as you're interviewing. What committees can I serve on? What else will I bring to the table? So,
the word just related to that, a lot of clients will say is, our business is going here, we want some perspective on this, but we're not looking for, quote unquote, a single issue director. So I think boards are looking for a unified, cohesive board that can challenge and debate, but come together. Mm-hmm. And they're recognizing, I think, more different points of view around areas they don't know enough about are valuable. But if you can't bring that back into an interview and talk business first and then bring the average other perspective, you won't be the finalist candidate. No. So
thank you. Years ago, you joined your first board at Joann Stores. How did you go from a CIO into a business leader into that first role? How did you find the role?
So I found it through the search firm that placed me at my job. I was the CIO of Office Depot, which is a big retailer in Florida, and he had placed me at Office Depot, and because the search firms all have connectivity between their placement practices and their board practices, there's a lot of communication. And they were looking for a CIO specifically for Joann, and he had recommended me to the board search practice leader, and that's how I got my first board role. So one piece of advice is, are you answering every search firm's phone call? Are you telling the recruiter network that you have that you're interested in a board? Do you have a CV that represents you for a board, not for a full-time CIO job? It's a different profile. And beginning to build that network within the recruiters. My second board, SPSS, came through my boss. He knew the head of, the chairman of SPSS. They were colleagues from way back when. He introduced me. And so that's an example of how a network can get you on a board. One, having a boss who would support it, but it was his network that actually found the opportunity. So I do think that there is something to the networking, and I tell people not to be shy. If you're looking for a board, do people know you're looking for a board?
Yep.
I meet CEOs and I build a relationship with them and talk to them, and I always end it with, if you're looking for directors, I'd be really interested and think I could bring value to your company. Why not? So are you telling people? That's how my first 2 boards happened.
And maybe share a little bit about the amount of time it takes to serve on a public board. Share a little bit about that process, like the time commitment, and how many years as well.
Well,
that you should
I
expect.
think that I tend to go into a board thinking 10. I actually got asked about 15, and I'm like, well, with board refresh, that's probably not as likely. And I think for an agile board, you have to be flexible to change your skill base all the time. And I think time commitment-wise, it's a lot. I mean, it is not a minor commitment. Most of my colleagues, and Tuck may know this, at 4 public boards is a full-time job, basically. For your prep work, for your participation in the meetings, anything else that you do to learn about the company or help influence. I spend a lot of time with the CIOs of my boards, coaching and helping them prepare for cyber reviews with audit committee and things like that. And I think you really have to be able to commit the time. If you have a situation where you're selling the company or the company's going public or you have an activist or something is in crisis, then it is a significant amount of time. So I think, and I would say every board has something like that happen in your tenure, right? So don't take it lightly. It's a commitment.
Tuck, maybe share a little bit about the recruiting process. You might work with a CEO and look at board composition and work with them for a year or 2 years, have a relationship with them. When you find interesting candidates, talk about that, maybe the interview process, what somebody could expect. How long does that take?
So just kind of the context quickly, the old world of board search was a little bit around, we have a board search, run a process, pre-screen a set of names, go one by one down the list, and you knew who many of the people on that list would be. The new search process, just what's different, is we're doing a lot more, I'll call it kind of evergreen planning with boards, where you have discussions with boards and CEOs. They're thinking about when people are rolling off of boards. You're talking strategically about the business. They're building a roadmap of skill sets. And so it's been a dialogue that's been going on for a bit of time typically. Then a spec kind of drops out of that when there's a role. Separate from that, we as a firm, because a lot of these profiles are new,
Yes.
we're building candidate pools around this. So we've been doing a whole series of Tech on Boards events with CIOs and otherwise in different markets to talk about these topics. And so I think this is really important. We're starting to do the same thing with women on boards in California. In any case, so the bottom line is make those connections and get involved in those discussions early, because in these kind of hot emerging areas, there's a window here for the next 5 years where there will be a bubble of demand, like take advantage of that, right?
Yes.
So when you get in the process, what's different, just in a nutshell, is because these are different roles, we're recommending to clients that they're trying very different kind of profiles on for size. And so you end up with probably 4, 5, 6 deliberately different kind of profiles that will start with a conversation with someone on the Nom and Gov committee, and then move to a couple other board members, and then move ultimately to the CEO or others. And my biggest piece of advice would be what you mentioned already: do a lot of homework on the business, understand what they're trying to do from a change agenda perspective, be able to walk in and ask really good business questions, and then in context, make it very clear. So you're trying to do ABC. Well, as I look at this, I've done ABC, right? And that's point one. Point two would be first-time board members interview as operators, not board members, which means don't take the conversation down to here. Talk at the business strategy level, connect the dots, allow lots of quiet, open space in the conversations. Let this older director who doesn't know what technology is process and ask you another question. Connect it back to business terms. Give them the context of strategic, how you think about boards. Tell them your value proposition, but at a high level, as if you're already in the boardroom. You will present differently, I think, than probably 3/4 of the other folks who walked in the door, is my experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the things you can do to prepare yourself is even your own interactions with your board at your company. I think that the concept of storytelling is very important, giving specific examples versus going into the weeds of, intrusion detection and, all the stuff that can get us all excited as technologists. I think you got to raise it back up a level and bring perspective, particularly even about risk, because a lot of what we do as technologists is risk, whether it's disruption planning or cyber or even just IT, generally across the company. So that's, I agree, very important.
As you and I were preparing, as the three of us were preparing, we talked a little bit about the role of either nonprofits on the path to the board or advisory roles on the path to the board. I've heard some say that that is not a stepping stone to board service. And actually, Tuck, you had a different opinion. So I'd love to hear, should these aspiring directors that we talk to join a nonprofit or join an advisory board, or do you advise against that?
Here's the way I think about it. So you should understand, A, your value proposition in terms of what's unique in terms of your skill sets, and then B, you should be able to convince a board that you're quote-unquote board ready. So the question is, really in the context of board readiness, what have you done that shows some interest, aptitude, knowledge of being board ready? I personally think a meaningful role on a nonprofit that's had some impact, or doing something in an industry association or a relevant advisory board, or being an investor in a startup company and being on that board, even. Okay. Those are nice gateways, but it's in the context of a bigger story, which probably says, I'm not just a CIO, I'm a business partner, I've had lots of board interaction, I've got this story of stuff where I kind of understand governance, not leadership, and it's building that story. That story can be quite different. I think these can contribute. I wouldn't invest in those as a pathway, thinking that's my path to the top. It's not. It's a small part of your story, my opinion.
I think that's really well said. It's, it's not the path, right? I don't look at it other than you getting exposed perhaps to Robert's Rules of Order, and kind of the procedural side of what happens in boards. I do look, when I do nonprofit and advisory work, one of the things I look at quite closely is who else is on the board, because that's part of building your network, right? So if you can, begin to grow and learn from the inspiration that comes around you in a nonprofit or in an advisory role, that can be very compelling to your story, right, about how you generate change. And the other thing I would say, advisory board roles are very different than public board roles. So advisory board roles tend to be very sales-oriented. They want the reputation you bring, and they want you to be able to talk to their customers, right, as well as advising the board. Public boards are very different. So, that's not the only thing advisory boards do, but and sure, everybody, wants to be on a great startup company that's going to go public or whatever, but, those are much more few and far between in the grand universe. So, I don't think it's a path, but, the experience can be useful.
I have one last question that I'll ask for Patty, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. Patty, have you ever said no when you've been offered a public company board role, and why?
I think I I've said no. Logistics is important.
Okay.
You got to be able to do it, particularly if you're working full time. Can you handle the logistics? How many meetings there are? When are the meetings? I mean, these are things. Matter of fact, the first thing you look at when you're called is schedule.
Board dates, exactly.
Board dates.
Yeah.
It's the very first thing you look at because you can never miss a board meeting. Never. Unless you have a personal tragedy or something, right? That's that commitment you're going to make. So logistics, is part of what you have to consider. And what was the question?
No, just why would you say no?
Why would you say no? Why I said no?
Yeah.
No, because I look at compensation now that I'm a retired CIO. I am interested in compensation. I think private equity boards, is one thing to consider, but a private equity board, it does act like a public company board in many cases, but the timing and requirements and the pay is different. Or if you're, the region of the country that you're in. Or the other consideration for me in joining Splunk's board was I knew this was my path. My career path was to be a professional director. I love being a director. I love the value that I can bring, and I feel in very many ways it's like giving back from my years of expertise. So I think that when you're going to say no to something, it's because you just sense it's not going to be something that you can create value for. And you have to be pretty particular. So, but one tech board is really important because once you retire, what's the issue? You have to stay relevant, right? You have to keep learning. So you have to find ways to increase your knowledge of what's current. And so I think having a mix of one technology board that keeps you current, and Splunk, for example, has security products, so that's useful to me and my board roles. That's been important for me in building my portfolio as well. So.
And I would double click on that comment. If you want to do the professional board thing, do a mix of disruptor and transformer because that will keep you fresh and feed you.
Yeah.
The other thing is when we are looking for these increasingly specialized areas of expertise, AI, IoT, part of what's attractive to them is getting you an adjacent non-competitive industry, but where the world is coming, like this conference, is coming to your doorstep and you have windows into that whole ecosystem and you can bring that back in the form of questions and connections and whatnot. So the roles you are all in are hugely relevant, not just because of what you're doing in the company, but the network and the perspective you have. So think of how you keep that fresh and leverage it. So.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for just a few questions. If anybody has a question for Tuck or Patty. The question's directed at Patty. Why do you think CIOs don't make the cut to the boardroom?
I think it's because they're not prepared for the interview. Are you prepared to answer a question, what is your philosophy on proxy access? Now, is that something you're going to get exposure to in your day job as a CIO? Well, it depends on maybe what your company's going through. But you need to be prepared. It is, the kinds of issues that you deal with on the board are different. Do you know what's going on in, say, on pay? You can use your own company as examples. I mean, I think that CIOs don't pass that. Can they be broad enough as a director versus just bringing a narrow slice to the position? And getting really good at answering that in the interviewing process and being prepared is why I think they fail. I don't know if you have other experience, but do you agree? Gina and I go way back. We know each other.
I would add, so it's that business context. The other piece I would say is there's very clearly, through an interview process, people are looking for, if they're going to put this at the board level, very transformational CIOs. So being able to articulate how you're connected to this digital transformation strategy, what your role is, how does it fit with others, that there's some that have managed use budgets. There's some are actually plugged in at the front and center and driving change. They can get the front end as well as the back end. That helps.
So if you need to be viewed as a transformational CIO, how important is it to get exposure with your brand? How important is it to produce content or be in the media? Does that matter?
I think it's most important to do it.
Okay.
I think the credibility of being in a company that's done something, being able to articulate how you went from the strategy level to whatever, and how you interface with your peers and kind of drive that is very different than being the person who somehow implements through technology someone else's transformation agenda. That's not hugely in demand at the board level.
Gotcha. One last question, anyone?
How long did you juggle a full-time job with a board position?
So the question was, how did you juggle?
For a very long time. So while I was the CIO at Motorola, I was on 2 public boards. And then when I went to Cardinal Health, I was on Splunk's board. Now, interestingly, why 2 boards? This is another story I tell. I went to my boss and said, you know, I've been here for umpteen years and I'm interested in my growth and development. Just because you're an executive at a company doesn't mean you stop growing, right? And I was interested in looking at other opportunities within the company, and for various reasons we couldn't make that happen. And I said, well then, would you be okay if I joined a second board? Because that's part of my growth and development. And interestingly, I picked Aramark at the time because big supply chain company and in the background of hospitality. And so there was a lot of parallels. And so I could learn a lot from that board and bring it back to my day job. And I think if you talk to executives in a company that are on public boards, it really makes you a better executive. And so I hope that your bosses support you being on a board, because I know that's not always true. That's sometimes a barrier. But you know, it's part of what you bring back to your day job. And of course, if you have a fantastic team, then you can do the time away. So forces you to delegate more. Did I answer your question?
You've ever considered serving on the board of a private venture-backed startup, and why or why not?
I have, and I do a couple of advisory boards, one in healthcare and one just in general IT services. It's selective for me because I think, you know, I have to really believe in the product. You know, so sometimes if I've never used the product in my own shop, I really have to understand its customer base. And so I want, as an advisory board for a private equity-backed startup, to be a evangelist advocate for that company. And so that's the criteria and lens I look at for private equity.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up. But Patty and Tuck, thank you so much for your insights today and sharing that with your audience. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.